My name is Dr. Rana Siu Inboden, and I'm a scholar at the Strauss Center. And on behalf of the Strauss Center, the Clements Center, and the Center for East Asian Studies, I'm delighted to present Carl Minster. He is a professor at Fordham Law School, the author of an exciting new book called End of an Era. And I've known Carl for a surprising number of years, maybe starting to be more than one decade for sure. Yeah. So some of you who have worked in Washington or will work in Washington in the future will know that it's a sharp-edged city, and the fact that I know Carl from those days and can still say that he's a friend, he's very insightful, he's principled, and he brings to his scholarship a wonderful mix of rigor and empathy, and I think you'll really enjoy his talk. So thank you for being here.
Welcome. Thank you so much. It's a very kind introduction by Rana, and it's my honor to be here. Thanks so much to Rana and to the staff at all three centers for putting together today's event. It's a real pleasure. I think I'm only my second time in Austin, and so it's a real pleasure to be here. What I'm going to do, I'll give you a short summary of the book in sort of one sentence, which is that China's decades-long reform era is ending, and that economically, ideologically, and politically, China is moving in a different direction from what we've known since the late 1970s. In this talk, I'm going to sort of set out the broad overall themes of the book and explain why I'm worried. And I'm going to specifically focus on the political component of what's taking place and explain how China is experiencing erosion of its reform era political norms and institutions. But it helps, sort of talking about China, it helps to sort of have a big overview when you begin. And so for the first 3 decades of the People's Republic of China, so from 1949 until the late 1970s, China, this is the Maoist era, China looked like this. Economically, it was stagnant. Pervasive rural poverty and a failed state-run economic system had left China by the late 1970s with a per capita GDP lower than that of India and lower than that of Zaire. Ideologically, it was relatively closed to the outside world. Not only were Western capitalist and Soviet revisionist practices decried, but Chinese tradition and all religion were ruthlessly suppressed in the name of socialist modernization. And politically, China was unstable. It was at the top of the system. Power was highly concentrated in a single leader, namely Mao Zedong, who had a regular he had a regular habit of purging his designated successors, one of whom died in a prison cell during the Cultural Revolution, the other whom perished in a mysterious plane crash when he was apparently attempting to flee to the Soviet Union in a failed military coup. And within society at large, well, one other point about politics is Mao preferred ruling instead of regular institutions of governance, preferred ruling through radical street movements and campaigns that called people out to attack the enemies of the day. Within society at large, as I mentioned, the preference was for relying on political campaigns and street movements, and in fact, government institutions and the party institutions themselves dissolved almost entirely during the period of chaos known as the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976. For the second 3 decades of the People's Republic of China, China looked like this. This is what we think of as the reform era. You can debate. 1978 is clearly the beginning, goes until the early 2000s. We can debate the particular end date that we want to pick. But China goes in a very different direction. Economically, China experiences decades of rapid economic growth. So market reforms launched in the 1980s lead China to experience 10% GDP growth year after year over the next 3 decades. And in the 1980s in particular, this is economic growth that's lifting all boats, particularly those of the poor. Ideologically, this period sees China open up. In Deng Xiaoping's famous words, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. Within the Chinese state and within schools, this gives a whole range of actors great freedom, great ability to selectively import ideas, concepts from abroad that they think might be relevant to resolving problems that China faces. And the party in this period also backs out of people's lives. So the ideological fervor of the Maoist era fades. Religion comes back. Muslim mosques, Christian churches reopen. Socialism begins to fade into sort of this meaningless set of slogans that sort of are recited on state television, but don't really have a lot of meaning in practice. Privately, as long as you don't cross the key line of attempting to organize politically, you actually have a broad degree of freedom to do what you want in your private life. Let me move on to the third point, politically. Politically, China's party leaders in this period support the emergence of a range of partially institutionalized political norms. And I'm going to emphasize the word partially. But these were not political liberalization. Particularly after Tiananmen Square, particularly after 1989, Beijing drew a hard line at anything resembling political liberalization. But the rules of the one-party political game became somewhat more organized and somewhat more institutionalized in this period, precisely because Chinese leaders themselves were trying to ward off the chaos that they themselves had experienced under the Cultural Revolution. So a sampling of these types of reforms, which were launched in the 80s and 90s during the reform era, would include designation by Deng Xiaoping of his next two successors, ensuring an unusual period of elite political stability. Development of internal norms regarding the regular promotion, retirement, and succession of party leaders. One such example, the 1982 Constitution, which established this two-term limit on the Chinese presidency. Partial depoliticization of the bureaucracy, with party authorities retreating from an effort to manage the day-to-day affairs of state and turning that responsibility over to technocrats within the bureaucracy, while the party continued to control the commanding heights of big policy-making decisions. Institutional differentiation. Party leaders started to assume control of more defined portfolios. This Politburo Standing Committee member is in charge of the economy. This Politburo Standing Committee member is in charge of propaganda, so forth and so on. And emergence of bottom-up input institutions. So the reform era sees local elections, sees administrative law channels, and it sees a partially commercialized media airing popular grievances, which it's a one-party system, so this is not political liberalization, but what these do is give citizens a limited degree of input into the political process and help contribute to state legitimacy. In short, if we're summarizing this period, what we're thinking of is economically, rapid growth, a degree of political openness, ideological openness, and relative political stability marked by partial political institutionalization. Now we're entering a different. We can debate the start dates that we want to talk about. Some of the trends I'm going to discuss actually extend back over a decade. But one way or another, these trends have become a lot more clear since 2012. We'll start with the economy first. Economically, China is starting to undergo a seismic shift. China's era of rapid growth is ending, or is coming to an end. Now, if you're an optimist, you're going to say, well, this is part of a secular and a demographic shift that resembles what took place in Japan and South Korea, which is to say that the economy is slowing down and it's eventually going to plateau at a lower level of growth, gradually plateau at a lower level of growth. If you're a pessimist, you're going to flag a series of what you see as unsustainable pressures in the Chinese economy that you think might lead to a dramatic hard landing, including this buildup in debt levels, which have surged from like 150% of GDP in 2008 to well over 250% now. It doesn't matter if you're an optimist or a pessimist, because one way or another, the key point is China's moving out of an earlier era of rapid growth, and it's entering a new period. Ideologically, China is closing up again, gradually turning inwards on itself again. This is showing up both in society, which is to say you see there's a renewed popular interest in Confucianism. One of the examples I like is the proliferation of faux Han Dynasty clothing for college graduation ceremonies. But it's also showing up in state actions. So things such as Xi Jinping, he made it 2013, he makes a pilgrimage to the birthplace of Confucius, and he declares that the Communist Party, after having spent the better part of the 20th century attempting to wipe out China's feudal heritage and eliminate Confucianism, needs to actually embrace traditional beliefs and fuse them with nationalism and Marxist-Leninism into state ideology. Now, of course, part of this shift is just an entirely natural one on the part of Chinese citizens themselves, which is to say, many people in China are beginning to quite understandably question, say, now that China, is much wealthier, now that we have China as a country has risen, shouldn't we perhaps take more of an interest in our own culture and our own traditions rather than simply blindly absorbing, everything that's coming from overseas, as was the case in the 80s and 90s? But another element, it's important to realize that there's another element to what's taking place, and this is a strategic move on the part of the state. China's new leaders are attempting to deploy Chinese tradition, as they're defining it, as a shield against what they view as quote-unquote foreign values, particularly Western ones. Among party elite, there's the sense that the collapse of communism as an ideology has left a spiritual and a moral void at the heart of the Chinese society, and that's permitted a whole range of foreign ideologies to kind of multiply. And this ranges from Western liberal democratic notions, includes underground Christian house church movements, and the fear on the part of, if you're a party propagandist, is this is going to sort of lead to the moral erosion or the greater degree of foreign influence within China. And so from their perspective, what they're looking for is what can we bring, what can we put on the table that we can erect as a shield against some of these foreign values, and they're turning slowly, gradually back to their own past with the idea that we need to more clearly reassert a narrative about China's own cultural and historical identity rather than simply relying on Marxism, which of course is a foreign import as well. And you've started to see this with this sort of new effort to work against Western influences in foreign textbooks and the like. I'm going to make one other small point about what's going on in the ideological front, which is when Beijing makes a more clear and closed narrative of what it means to be Chinese, you try to define Chinese in a more narrow ethno-nationalist version. One of the things that it does, it starts to increase tensions within China with the people who fit less well into that narrative. So particularly the folks on the borderlands. So that's precisely why you see the Chinese authorities make the effort to push patriotic education into the Hong Kong schools 2010, 2011. And what that gives rise to is the birth of student organizations like Scholarism that then eventually produce Occupy Central protests of 2014. Essentially what you've got is a bunch of Hong Kong youth, Cantonese-speaking Hong Kong youth, who find their identities radicalized because they feel that there's a new narrative coming from Beijing, and they don't have space to fit into that. Similarly, when you see central efforts to sort of tighten controls over Uyghur Muslim identity in the northwest area of Xinjiang, anti-veiling campaigns where you attempt to point out, encourage women to drop the veil. What's the effect of that? You essentially radicalize, radicalize believers in that fuels Islamic radicalization. Or if you look at some of the things that are going on right now, Zhejiang, other provinces with significant Christian populations, Chinese authorities make more pressure on those groups. You end up fueling a range of conflicts with Christian believers there. None of these are imminent threats to Chinese stability. Each of these is a community of couple tens of millions of people in a much larger country of 1.4 billion. But the point simply is that China is now beginning to move in a different direction. This is something different from what you would have seen 10 or 15 years ago. Now I'm going to move on to the third element, which is the political dynamic. And this is the element that I think has attracted most attention when people are focusing on, because people are particularly focused on elite Chinese politics. And it plays out, the trends that I'm talking about, of course, intersect with these constitutional and elite leadership shifts. So politically what you're seeing is a breakdown in what we thought were those established norms and institutions. Since Xi Jinping's rise in 2012, he's broken with many of those norms that I talked about earlier. So, for example, the takedown of former security czar Zhou Yongkang in 2013, that marked a breakdown of tacit reform-era norms where top-level organization in China, the Politburo Standing Committee, the previous norm was if you had been at the top level in the Politburo Standing Committee, once you stepped down, you and your family wouldn't be personally, certainly wouldn't be hauled off to jail for life, which was what happened to Zhou Yongkang. So that was a breakdown of a very clear central level norm, and following that, to see a range of these top-level leadership groups which concentrated power that had previously that had concentrated power that was previously divided among a range of other top party leaders. You reconcentrate that in the hands of Xi Jinping as a single leader. You start to see this long-standing aversion to anything. There'd been this Cultural Revolution era taboo against anything resembling a cult of personality around the top leader. That's giving way as well, because you're seeing state media beginning to devote much more attention to Xi Jinping himself vis-a-vis other leaders. It's not a full-blown cult of personality. I'm pretty careful to use the term whiff of cult of personality, but this is different again from what you saw in the 1990s Jiang Zemin era or the early 2000s Hu Jintao era. Within this past year, you've seen a couple other norms fall as well. So in the spring, everyone was focused on the party leadership, or there are two meetings that took place that focused people's attention. Fall 2017, Xi Jinping has completed one 5-year term as Party General Secretary. He's entering his second term as Party General Secretary last fall 2017. The prior experience had been that as that top leader entered his second term as Party General Secretary, party leaders would sort of anoint or give some sort of signal as to who the next succeeding top person would be. We had none of that. In fact, there was no immediate successor to Xi Jinping designated, and simultaneously, 6 months later, in the spring, what took place was the Chinese National People's Congress removed the constitutional 2-term limit on Xi Jinping's role as state president, not his party role, but the 2-term limit that would have blocked him in the Constitution from serving 5 years as state president. Would limit him to 10 terms, 2 consecutive 5-year terms as state president. You put those two things together, and it's a pretty clear signal that we're leaving open the possibility, or at least maybe signaling, I'm going to stay on, unlike Hu Jintao, unlike arguably Jiang Zemin, I'm going to stay on for more than 10 years. And that, if you start looking at that and you think, well, that's potentially a breakdown of yet another norm set in the reform era where you would have limited, we're not going to let one person devolve into a lifetime ruler like Mao. Maybe that's starting to topple as well. That's certainly what a lot of people in China think. Anyway, so that's the set of things that folks have been paying attention to in the media. I'm going to give you 3 other things that I think are really worth paying attention to that I think haven't received enough attention, because I think there are 3 other things that are starting to break down that are really important for China's future. And the first is another shift in elite Chinese politics. So top-level institution in China is the Politburo Standing Committee. Under the tacit norms that we understood them as of the 1980s and 1990s, there were these age limits that, once you hit a certain age, 68, you would not be allowed to sort of continue on future. This was a way of avoiding the problem that had plagued the Soviet Union, where you ended up getting this aging gerontocracy in the 80s. The whole Politburo Standing Committee is over 80 years old, and your system just sort of grinds down. Reform era sees these tacit norms about retirement ages develop. And last fall, in the 5-year at the party congress that took place last fall, the anti-corruption chief Wang Qishan stepped down. He was a figure closely identified with Xi Jinping. People thought this might be Xi Jinping's right-hand man. He's helping purge the party of corruption. And so when people saw Wang Qishan step down, as expected because of his age, people were initially thinking, hey, despite what's happening with Xi Jinping, maybe this is a signal that those age limits have some kind of bite. And in fact, what you actually saw was Wang Qishan, despite not having any sort of formal party post, he was given an important position as state vice president, and he's bearing significant responsibility for foreign affairs. In addition, he seems to be sitting on the Politburo Standing Committee meetings, which is interesting, not actually having a position. And the reason why this is interesting is because it raises the possibility that the rule at the top of the Chinese system could kind of devolve into something like Xi and associates, regardless of what titles they actually hold. And if that, I mean, again, we're far from that at the moment, but you can sort of see the outlines of something going on there. If you start walking down that path, you begin to worry about things such as the marginalization of party institutions themselves, such as the Politburo Standing Committee, and that would potentially start to take China back to pre-1978 era, where you had figures with no formal position at all, like Mao Zedong's wife, taking significant responsibility for the running of the Cultural Revolution. And then you get, that's how you start to get to some really complicated power struggles. The second point that I'm going to shift that I think people have not paid enough attention to is something that's taking place at the middle and lower levels of the Chinese bureaucracy. And that's the repartization of the Chinese bureaucracy. And again, if you remember what I just mentioned earlier, the reform era had seen the party itself take a step back from the line management of the bureaucracy itself. That seems to now be ending as well. If you look at the constitutional amendments that took place in the spring that created created a National Supervisory Commission, theoretically aimed at taking, in large part, aimed at corruption. And what this effectively does is it takes the party's disciplinary inspection apparatus and in a remodeled form gives it a broader range to go after anyone in the government, anyone receiving a government salary. And note how different this was from beforehand. Previously, the party's disciplinary inspection apparatus was authorized to go after party members, but that doesn't include all state members. And what this amendment and the corresponding legislation do is create a channel for that body to potentially go after anyone receiving a state salary, which if you guys are at UT Austin, you should be thinking about what's that. It's not just government. I mean, that's potentially university professors as well. And so that may begin to allow those black box norms that exist, that had always existed within the party, greater spread within the state apparatus as well. Similarly, if you want to think this through, you can also look at the new government reorganization plan that was released a couple months ago. What it does is it eliminates a whole host of government organs and merges them with party ones. So for example, the State Civil Service Board, that goes away and gets merged with the Party Organization Bureau. The State Administration of Religious Affairs gets merged with the party's United Front Work Department. And on the one hand, you could say, well, this doesn't really matter. The party was always standing on top of things. They were making the big decisions. But on the other hand, this really does matter because you're eliminating a range of middlemen, the technocrats, and you're putting the party cadres much more directly in the driver's seat for a range of responsibility. When I did this talk for business community, the thing that people are interested in is they're seeing this effort to revive the role of party cells in corporate entities, not just domestic Chinese entities, but foreign JVs, and that it reflects this idea that's part of one of the Xi Jinping's key principles is that the party needs to reassert its ruling. It needs to become once again the ruling force, not just within the government, but throughout society and all major decisions. So that's the government, that's society at large. The third shift that I sort of have written in here, but the New York Times just did a sort of a front page piece on it just 48 hours ago. I was going to say that the intensification of repression that's taking place in Xinjiang is an area that hasn't received sufficient attention, but now I think it actually is starting to break into the public consciousness. So this western region of Xinjiang, heavily Muslim, populated by an ethnic minority known as the Uyghurs. Of course, concerns about ethnic unrest and border security have meant that Beijing has always had a tougher hand there than elsewhere. And it was ramped up once already in the bout, after a very violent bout of inter-ethnic rioting in 2009, which saw both Han and Uyghur deaths. But since 2017, there's actually been, last year, there's been another qualitative leap in the level of repression. So specifically, Beijing has constructed a web of political re-education camps to which a significant percentage of the Uyghur population, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, some people speak of 1 million, have been preemptively disappeared. And the state efforts to sort of target identity and religion shuttering mosques, creating systems by which party cadres live in people's homes to observe their internal family practices, those are being ramped up as well. And of course, in and of itself, this is a major human rights issue and one which is just starting to percolate into public consciousness. But to my mind, it also represents a really important breaking of yet another reform era norm. Let me explain this. So in Maoist era China, as I mentioned, society was extensively politicized. Broad swaths of people were mobilized, were labeled. Bad class background, former landlord, landless peasant, and you create systems by which you pit different groups of society against one another. You tie benefits, college education, to the labels that somebody has been attached to. That really came to an end with the beginning of the reform era. Sure, Beijing still was coming down on dissidents like a hammer, particularly people who were engaged in organization, labor organizing and the like. But this use of broad labels to kind of indiscriminately classify large chunks of society had dropped off. What specifically worries me about what I'm seeing in Xinjiang right now is I can see how that starts to go by the wayside, and those cracks in Chinese society start to get revved up again. So reports suggest that some of these practices are starting to migrate out of Xinjiang and into Ningxia and Gansu, which are Muslim populations but not Uyghur populations. Once you see that, you start thinking, are there any other groups in society that might also be, of concern? And you can start to put yourself in the position of a party bureaucrat and start thinking that, well, maybe other groups, whether it's, say the large Christian population, is also something that we have to start thinking about. And then it could start to spin from there. We're far from that at the moment, but something's going on in Xinjiang that makes me think something has gone over the edge, and I'm really worried about that. So, broad summary, China is ideologically closing up, it's economically slowing down, and those partially institutionalized political norms of the reform era are starting to come undone. So, why is all this happening? Why are the norms coming undone? And the core answer that I give is that because of China's failure to build alternative institutions during the reform era, arising from this dogged adherence to the one-party, principle of one-party political rule, Xi Jinping finds himself driven back to yet older methods to make change happen. And the way I think of it is, put yourself in Xi Jinping's shoes when you're coming to power in 2012. You're a committed believer in the party's continued political dominance. You sense China is slouching towards crisis. You see corruption spreading up within the party itself. You see a frozen and factionalized political system that's the result of the Hu Jintao era. You reject any move towards political liberalization. That's off the table since 1989. What do you do? What do you do to make change happen? I sort of think he made the choice that he could, which was resort to the levers that you do have. Try to centralize power in your own hands. Launch politicized purges of your rivals. Try to consolidate power back in your own hands. Cultivate a populist image among the masses, and promote this ideological shift back to nationalism and cultural identity. So now, moving to the conclusion, what does all this mean? So for some people, they would say this means Xi is a new Mao, and I don't go that far. I think there still are several reform era norms that haven't yet been broken, and the big one to watch is resort to bottom-up social mobilization. The Maoist era, Mao was calling people out on the streets to attack people in the bureaucracy and to attack his enemies in society. There's been no sense that Xi Jinping wants to call the students out to go after his enemies. Everything that's taking place right now is top-down control. But you want to watch that last norm to see if that gets broken, because that is a really big one to watch. And the key thing, however, for me is once I start walking down this thought process and I start concluding that the norms of the reform era are coming undone, I think the operative question starts to be, which is the next one that's going to start to go? And just to be clear, while this story that I'm telling is a China-specific story of political erosion within China's one-party system, I'm actually not bashing China. The idea that political norms are breaking down has parallels even in democratic societies. Look at Turkey, look at India, look at the Philippines, and look at the United States. In fact, if I were a US expert, I might try to tell a story. I might not change the title of the book, totally different content, but I might try to tell a story where the last 2 decades of the 20th century saw a fusion of money and party politics that led to a steady erosion of American political institutions by the early 21st century. Existing norms began to give way. Bipartisan compromise, actually having a federal budget, every annual federal budget. Senate rules regarding the use of the filibuster. Ideology closed down. There was a turn inwards against immigration and against free trade. There was a slide towards alternative mechanisms of government, direct communication over Twitter, the use of vaguely defined leadership groups involving the family members, the cult of personality over experience, the purge of the head of the Domestic Security Service and the Diplomatic Corps, because that's a Texan, and so I had to get the reference in there. So you can draw this parallel, but if I'm trying to tell that story, that's the story you could try to tell about the United States. But the important thing is, of course, there are crucial differences. In China, what's taking place is a top-down process driven by Xi Jinping and those around him, rather than what we're experiencing, a bottom-up process. But make no mistake, this political erosion is, I think the risks of this in China are just as severe, if not more so, than in the United States. Because if you're like me, if you're worried about what's happening in the United States, I think you also have to ask yourself, what happens when you see political erosion take place in a country like China, where the entire institutional political architecture is of much more recent vintage, i.e. the late 1970s, and the history of severe political turbulence, i.e. the Maoist era, is even more recent. And that's why I think this is so risky, because I think once these things start coming undone, I think the underlying problems that plagued the pre-reform era start pushing themselves kind of zombie-like back to the surface again. So I'm talking about things like local officials competing to exalt the top leader, breakdown of channels of information at the top of the system as people become increasingly unwilling to reflect back negative information to the top, efforts to spread party controls back into areas from which they'd retreated, academia, culture, and business. More vicious internal score settling within the party elite as norms continue to break down, and potentially at some point a repoliticization of society. All of that, I think, spells trouble. I think in the short term it bodes for a more hardline, personalized authoritarian state, but in the longer term I think it's a recipe for a revival of the kinds of internal political instability that many observers had thought was dead and buried with the beginning of the reform era. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions, or I'll let Rana moderate.
Thank you so much. I'm going to abuse my power as the moderator and start off the first question. Not that I like those trends either in China or our own country, but I just was wondering what the masses in China think. You hear different things. People referring to him as Xi Dada, some people feeling very much that the personal space they have started to enjoy is being eroded with things like the social credit system, facial recognition, technology. So love to hear your comments on that.
Right. I think some of this, there's a big variety depending on who you talk to in China on some of these trends. Of course, if you are a liberal intellectual who happens to be sort of working in a state university or something, you're looking at these trends and you're really worried because you're deeply aware of some of the historical resonance. You're also seeing the trends are starting to percolate into your own life. Your ability to arrange conferences in your own institution. Your ability, you're seeing sort of those the political study sessions that are taking place every Tuesday or Wednesday are beginning to sort of become more intense. You're feeling different signals are coming to you. If you're on the bottom of the system, if you're sort of imagine that you're a person at the bottom of the system who's sort of been bypassed somewhat by the trends of the reform era. You could have a dramatically different reaction. You could look at the fact that some of those corrupt officials, they're falling. The big guy's taking down. Finally he's getting his due. He's getting dragged out, and you're thinking this is good. For some other people, you still haven't necessarily felt a significant impact. You try to stay apolitical. You say, well, I'm still able to run my business the way I want, and I just don't think about politics at large. I think there's a spectrum depending on who you talk to about what's going on. Of course, if you talk to a lot of my friends are on that sort of liberal camp, and so they're very worried about these trends. And it's not just them. I mean, I think the interesting thing now is to sort of see the business executives, a lot of people making that decision to sort of get their money and get their children out of China. I feel like there's a range of people beyond simply the liberal intellectuals who are worried about what could happen, and they're making a choice to kind of diversify risk.
Okay, great, thank you. Because we are filming this, please introduce yourself and try to state clearly your question so we can pick it up. And I saw a question. Okay, Josh and then Claire.
So my question is, what scope is there from the outside to shape China's trajectory? So my friend Tom Wright has a book on All Measures Short of War, and he's talking about rising geopolitical rivalry with China. And so there are issues like South China Sea, over which we don't have compatible interests, and trying to figure out how to resolve that. And then there are other issues of interdependence like climate change, where China's trajectory is really important for the future of the world. So what can other countries do?
So they told me to repeat the question as well so they can pick it up. But the question was sort of what scope is there for folks, sort of outside influence on developments within China? I think partially it depends on sort of what are the issues that you're talking about. You flagged a couple issues, South China Sea. You flagged the issue of climate change. And of course, some of the things I'm talking about are really domestic issues, which is to say, does the system politically evolve in one direction or another? I think the third one's actually the hardest one for, just like China's big, the United States is big. If you sort of think of like what's the ability of France or Germany to influence our internal domestic politics, I tend to think that the answer for both China and the United States is, at the end of the day, most of what happens within the direction of our country most of what happens within the direction of China is going to be decided by Chinese people and Chinese leaders themselves, and we on the outside, we can talk, but it's going to be they're the ones who make the ultimate decision. For these other issues, I think it is akin to what you experience with other countries, which is to say there's a range of conflicting interests. There are people in China. The climate change, regardless of what's happening on the domestic, whether China's becoming more or less authoritarian, there are practical interests on the part of Chinese leaders. Certainly don't want Tianjin or Shanghai to get flooded and then that to produce a wave of refugees. So that is clearly a subject that there is ability to talk to. Other ones are more conflictual. The South China Sea, I'll leave that to the foreign policy people, because I think some of those are, that's the classic geopolitical stuff that people who are looking at, international relations have to deal with.
Claire?
So my name is Claire. I am a dual degree student here at LBJ in the law school. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And I work for Strauss. So my question is the converse of Professor Lefty's. How do these degradation of norms within China affect the global community, especially looking at global engagement increasing in places like Africa?
Yeah, so that's tricky, because I think you almost have to. There's one element, which is that one way or the other, as China rises on the global stage, it's going to have a bigger influence on the world generally. That's like, even if it was democratic, if it was one way or another, that's going to happen. You're kind of pushing the question like, well, as China evolves in sort of a more authoritarian direction, what does that mean for its engagement, or in terms of its interaction with other countries? That's complicated, because I think, on the one hand, China is, party authorities in Beijing are trying to make the world safe for China, or make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party. So when it comes to things that sort of Rana has looked at, like the international human rights regime, there long-term sustained pressure to sort of try to shape that in particular ways that are responsive to China's interest. And what this means for global institutions that sort of grew up in a post-World War II era of American leadership and American influence, as if America continues to step back from the stage, that starts to create the possibility that these institutions will begin to get shifted. I think on that, you flagged the issue of Africa. I think one of the things, sort of I go on that riff, I think I'm not sure that the Chinese really realize I think Beijing doesn't fully understand the possibility of anti-Chinese sentiment that can get unleashed. It doesn't have anything to do with the West. You take over a Sri Lankan port for a 99-year lease. It's weird because Hong Kong, 99-year lease, sense of resentment. There's stuff. I had a Sri Lankan admiral in one of my talks who was really going off on this particular issue. There is a possibility for some of the moves that China is doing in these other countries to backfire and be really problematic. And I really am not sure that people in the party apparatus themselves fully appreciate this, because they're set up to think of themselves as victims vis-a-vis the West. But the idea that sort of Sri Lanka or China, or you could have problems like that blow up against you, is I think something they haven't fully encountered, and so I would be expecting more of that to sort of start to crop up. I'll stop there and take another.
I think we have.
Yes, hi. My name is Commander George Floyd. I teach over at the Department of Naval Science. Absolutely honored to be here. But my question is, and in your comments, you were very careful to refer to President Xi as a cult-like personality. And you also talked about the authoritarian nature of Chinese government and that it being a very top-down process. My question is this: absent President Xi, I think he's currently like 65 or so. What do you see the trajectory in? Is what we see now, is that sustainable, absent of a figure like President Xi?
So, I mean, just sort of one point is sort of, at the moment I would say it's a whiff of a cult of personality. It's not a full-blown. If you really are thinking about cult of personality and you're going back to the 50s and 60s, you really are thinking about students out on the streets screaming with Mao's book, hundreds of thousands of people cramming into Tiananmen Square to sort of touch, not just touch the hand of the leader, but touch the hand of the person who touched the hand, hand of the person who touched the leader. That's the level of craziness going back there. That's not there yet. At the moment, it's just much heavier attention to him than other people, and some of these language, Shidadan. So it's still not. You can't really say it's like that earlier era. But you were asking, is this trend sustainable? And what worries me is you now have a situation where those norms of how you pick your top leader seem to be vaporizing in front of us. And so then you start having to predict, like, what happens in 5 years, what happens in 10 years, what happens in 15 years. So one of my colleagues was like, what happens if he has a heart attack? And the answer is, we just don't know. We now no longer have confidence that we understand how that succession takes place. And if that's the case, that does create this possibility for power struggles between different people who think, I should be in charge or I shouldn't be, or you shouldn't. And once you start to have to worry about that, then you really start to call back how that instability worked in the pre-reform period. So the short answer is, I don't think we know, and I think the precedent that we have to go on should make us even more worried from the standpoint of how this could evolve. They were on the trajectory of some kind of institutionalized path, and now that seems to have been cut short.
Great. I think Tommy had a question.
Yes, please. Tommy Jameson, doctoral fellow here at the Climate Center. And I was wondering, how does the government see the role of the overseas Chinese population, the Chinese diaspora?
That's
an asset. How does it fit into the story?
That's a really good question. I'll tie this back to the question you asked. So, in fact, if you were asking me specifically about sort of the influence, I think that's actually one of the top things to think about, because look, the part, Beijing's attitude towards the diaspora has been, if you're thinking over 50, 75 years, has shifted. So under in the prior era, the Maoist era, China was sort of autarkic. We're a bounded state, and we're trying to keep influence. We just don't want influence to come in. So the diaspora then, you're looking at, sort of Western educated or Southeast Asian Chinese, intense suspicion. I mean, that's the type of things that were getting people blacklisted in that era, was having the oversized Chinese connections. Beijing is now pivoting in a different way, which is to say, Beijing, under Xi Jinping in particular, now that it's shifting to sort of this more ethnic, we're going to back off of Marxism, we're going to shift to starting to have more of an ethno-nationalist bent. Part of that is also, we're going to make really strong appeals to the diaspora overseas. And when I don't just mean appeals, I mean, we want to get control over the Chinese language media in other countries. We're worried about sort of independent Chinese language media publications in Canada or Australia or the United States, which might become platforms for stuff to get disseminated back into mainland China and create a problem for us. now they're deploying the power of advertising dollars, state banks, and the like to sort of try to co-opt pressure. And in Australia and Canada, they've been largely successful. You sort of have shut down non-CCP voices. And what that does, of course, is then, okay, that guards against this stuff coming into China itself. But then it also means that you're starting to try to have some kind of influence outside your own borders among what's going on there. And so then you link that to sort of stronger appeals to the diaspora. I think this is one of the top areas to be worried about, not in the sense, and the reason why I'm saying, I mean, these are our citizens. I mean, these are, it's a mix. So citizens, permanent residents, and everybody. And Beijing is aggressively targeting this group. And I think this is something we need to think through. But what worries me is particularly in the given political climate in the United States, it would be very easy for me to imagine within 6 months to a year, the stuff that you see directed on the part of the government here, the Trump administration, against Mexican immigrants starts getting deployed in a very different direction against Chinese Americans. And so all of a sudden this community starts getting, this is a perfect recipe for some bad stuff happening. And so I think there needs to be some way to think through this problem that sort of adheres to our own best values of liberalism, that says, these are our people. This is not an outside community that we're sort of is foreign, that's aliens. These are our people, and you are targeting them. And how do we go about addressing that? I don't fully have an answer to that, but I don't want us to slip into that sort of crazy nativism stuff that's starting to blow up in some corners. Yeah.
There's a gentleman in a Nike hat.
My name is Barry Young. I'm a CEO of a company that does a little bit of business, or quite a bit of business in China. You made this case that said, well, the Chinese economy the growth is not accelerating anymore. They're, in fact, creating some debt. We're starting to see a lot of corruption that has to be dealt with. And then that was the case you made for Xi Jinping saying, how do I solve all these problems? I got to take control myself. I have two questions. One is, what if Xi Jinping said, hey, I'm a young man, I'm only 60 or whatever, I'm going to be around for another 25, 30 years. I don't want to give this up. I love this. This might have been a sort of a top-down rather than a bottom-up. How do you argue against that? And the second question is, however you answer that, with better centralization in terms of what's going on in the economy, how is that going to impact the rest of the world when it comes to sharing technology? We've had a long history of the Chinese saying, you want to come here? Give us your technology. Then that's moderated quite a bit. But if we go back to this question of unilateral control, what do you think that would change?
Sure, and I need to reiterate that question for the mics. So the first part of the question was, how do we interpret Xi Jinping taking greater control over the political system? Is this top-down or a bottom-up strategy? And the second part is, what are the implications of that for economic management, such as sort of efforts to sort of compel sharing of technology through corporate interactions. With the first part, I totally agree. I think it actually is top-down. I think the U.S., what's taking place in the U.S. is a bottom-up strategy. I think what's taking place in China is a top-down strategy. I think the moves that are taking place are being driven by Xi Jinping himself. This is not a situation where people are going out on the streets and mobilizing, and that's the last thing that the party wants. And in fact, the people who have tried that strategy, some of the activists will get out on the streets, say anti-corruption, hold up the banners, anti-corruption, we need more of, more asset disclosure stuff. The party comes down on them just as hard as it comes down on the people who are sort of attempting to organize labor stuff, because they don't want spontaneous bottom-up organizing. What Xi Jinping is doing is basically making that decision that you said, which is, I want to be around for a long time. I'm worried about potential rivals. I'm worried about my ability to sort of get control over segments of society. I want to strengthen the party throughout the board, within the government. I want to strengthen the party within the economy. I want to strengthen the party within society, so I can exercise greater sway. And I think, one of the questions is, if you've been doing that for 10, 20, 30 years, do you decide at some point that you want to give up power, or do you actually think, I might be worried about, his predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, have found their power bases significantly reduced precisely of what he's doing. I would be thinking the logical question that if you were him, is you'd be thinking, well, might the next person to come after me do the same, and so maybe I better hold on as long as possible. But I think the problems with that then go into this. There's one of the problems when you centralize power in a single individual is person gets older, they've been around for a long period of time. People stop wanting to give him the bad information. The early reform era, the 80s, was a period in which there was more open discussion, even within the party itself. Different people had different ideas. Let's bat around how we handle this. The problem when you have a single decision maker and you're really afraid to sort of bring stuff up is then everyone says, well, everything's under control. And that idea you had, boss, was the great one, and just make me party secretary of Shanghai. There's a very dysfunctional set of incentives that happen. And what I'm seeing now, if you think about the way the Chinese stock market bubble occurred in 2015, 2016, you are seeing some of that stuff begin to percolate into top-level decision-making. And I really worry that makes the system unable to address latent problems. It's kick the can down the road rather than resolve the latent problems, and then sort of bandwagoning on whatever idea. There's a big interest in soccer right now in China because Xi Jinping's made it a priority. Massive spending on soccer's got to be. That's now a sort of a major priority. You think back to the Maoist era where, when Mao got his head around doing something, everyone jumped in that direction. Is that good for the country? Well, you got to think about that.
Thank you. My name is Steve Person. It heard recently about, I guess it's a social networking system, social credit scores that you can explain it to me. The government is introducing that is mandatory and will rate people on their goodness and give their possibilities of advancement. Is there pushback against that?
So the social credit, the system in theory works like this, which is that you have a credit score in the United States that's linked to sort of your debt, you're paying your credit card back, et cetera, et cetera. So in China, the idea is we tie all that in there, partially because they do have these honest concerns about sort of whether people are paying their debt, but then you go a little bit broader. You start, did you turn your library books in on time? Were you engaged in any politically inappropriate speech? For the one that came up for the celebrities was you get the celebrities, you get some institute like the Chinese Academy of Social Science to sort of rate celebrities, movie stars and the like, as to sort of whether they've made charitable contributions or whether they have whether the pictures that they're appearing in are socially valuable. And you start using these tactics to shape behavior on a larger scale. I think some of the reporting is sort of, it seems extremely Orwellian and like China's going to have total social control over everything. I think in practice what's going to happen is there's going to be, Chinese people are really good about faking data and stuff like this. So I think that Uyghurs are going to be driven out of any sort of financial transactions because there'll be this crazy redlining stuff that'll get applied to marginalized community. People will start to figure out ways to create fake identities to do things. So it's not going to be a perfect tool of social control, but it's going to amplify all of the trajectories that are taking place in Chinese society as well. And part of that is going to be extremely repressive to particular groups of people. And some people are upset about it. Some people think, hey, this is great because the people who deadbeats can't buy train tickets or something, that some people think, hey, that's great. Flash your name up on the train station, thing, and we know who the, social shaming,
In the back.
My name is Miles Abernathy. Do you have any comments on the tariff war that we seem to be having with China?
So I'm not, foreign policy isn't so much I don't the specific, I sort of look at these things from the perspective of domestic policies. I do think this is from a big picture, I think this is yet another, if I was phrasing, my talk is very much on domestic politics in China. If I wanted to try to loop this into a broader point about US-China relations, I would say that, one of the other elements if you're periodizing, the last 50 or 70 years, is the reform era witnessed a greater interdependency of the U.S. and the Chinese economies on one another. What looks to me to be right now partially concerns over technology that are taking place both in China. The Snowden stuff really freaked them out. In the United States, Huawei's influence here. You're getting within society and government, you're seeing this sense that maybe we need to decouple. And these specific moves that are taking place, and I suspect, I'm not an expert on corporate policy, but I expect that there are a lot of firms that are beginning to try to figure out how do we change our supply chains. I know the goal of the Trump administration is bring all this stuff back to the United States. I suspect in reality, probably what's happening is a lot of people are starting to think about relocating to Bangladesh or Vietnam and are wondering whether that's possible. But that would be, a major change. It would be the reversal of another step in the reversal of a several decades long pattern of U.S.-China relations. That would be my best chance to try to link it to.
I think we had another question in the back row.
Yeah, my name's Rob. I'm a senior at the Asian Studies and Online Studies of Chinese Nation. So I just asked one question. So we hear so little about the politics of the actual Chinese people and their opinion. So let's say China holds an election. You have the Reformist Party, which is now in government, and their policies representing that. You have the hardliner party, Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, and their policies representing them. Who would win the popular vote?
I mean, I think it's in some ways it's so hard to conceive of how that would work. Like, how would you present? How would you even have that without one group? If you really open that up, then you're like, well, somebody's got to liquidate somebody in advance, and so it's just like, how do you get even to that point? Look, I mean, I think part of your question is how popular is he? I think a lot of people think he's popular. I mean, it's not. It's a very big country, and some of the stuff that he's doing, think about appealing to the masses to say that China needs to be stronger, that we are standing up to the foreigners. That is not a lot of people in China have seen their lives get much better over the last several decades. You're seeing these pockets of problems blow up in different areas, but it isn't like this is necessarily unpopular for a large range of people. In practice, it's almost like a black box. We have no way of gauging the actual support one way or the other. The question of do you support Xi Jinping? If you're asking an ordinary Chinese person, what's the other choice? I mean, there's no other. It's not like I can weigh it against anything. For many people, it's more like the local party cadre in my area. I'm angry about something he did, but I don't necessarily link that to the system at large. The system at large is just the system at large. And so how would it's hard to sort of say I can just make a judgment in the air about what another system would be. Some people are very disgruntled. I mean, some people feel like everything is shot through with problems and I'm completely unhappy. That doesn't necessarily mean, I want liberal democracy. It may mean I want people dead, or I want revolution, or I want to go back to Mao when Mao was really Mao. And what I really want to do is to sort of take all those guys in Shanghai, whether it's the wealthy individuals or those party cadres, and I want to bring them down. And I want to take their stuff. That's what is that? It's not a liberal democracy versus autocracy. That's like I want real revolution. You got a group of those people out there too, who are sort of the hardcore Maoist, folks too.
And we have Professor Pitt.
Yeah, my question is, when you were describing in the beginning of your talk this sort of move towards nationalism, it came across to me as sort of a strategy, like a top-driven strategy. And my question is, to what degree is it possible that he's following and not leading in that trend? It sort of relates to the last question, I think, but I mean, the separation between what was happening economically and communist ideology was getting greater and greater and harder to reconcile. And I think a Chinese middle class that have benefited from this, but they're very nationalistic. I mean, so to what degree is he just saying this is a better way, it's a more popular, more supported, a stronger base to build upon?
So I think nationalism does have a degree of support. to put it in the big historical perspective, but of course, the Chinese Communist Party always presented it as sort of the nationalist hero that sort of took China out of the pre-45, the pre-49 decade, the century of humiliation. They always presented themselves in a particular nationalist way. But up until like late 80s, early 90s, the real front of the party was Marxism. The real front was communism. The fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Eastern Bloc, China's own reforms, started to mean that communism really didn't have a hold. Particularly after 1980, particularly after Tiananmen Square, the party started to realize we've got to do something different. And that's the patriotic education campaign kicks in like 1991, which is, you can sort of see why they're doing it at that point. That's the point at which within the state media sphere and the like, you start seeing anti-Japanese films referring to the war, referring to the humiliation that China has suffered. Those start to sort of really escalate at that period. And if you're thinking about China and what's taking place, part of it helps to recognize that, in China, just like any society, you have people who are dissatisfied with things. You might be dissatisfied about it. You're dissatisfied. I'm a laid-off worker, either in West Virginia or in Heilongjiang, who's like a coal, but what am I going to do? I'm an educated individual who sort of wants to do something for my country, and how do I participate? And when you start opening that nationalist vent, one of the things that it does is it allows people in society who might be unhappy about a couple of different things to say, this is a politically authorized thing that I can jump into, whether it's, anti-Taiwan movements, anti-Japanese movements. And so I think for some people, you start to say, this is a space, it's not challenging the party, it's kind of going along with what they want, and that space develops as something that people can exercise some degree of voice in. And so I think there is an element of that, of the nationalism, that this is the one sort of space the party has begun to open up some. The problem from the party's perspective is that can flip both ways. On the one hand, you want that national sentiment because, by God, if there's ever a problem with Japan or the United States, or there's another, Chinese plane that goes down because there's a conflict with a U.S. one, the people are like on your side. But the flip side is, when the trade war, picks up, the question is, do people think you're doing enough against those guys? That sentiment can kind of skew both ways, and the party itself is really worried about it. So on the one hand, it's something they work with. On the other hand, they're also really worried about it. You go back in history, you can see situations where that popular sentiment turns against Chinese authorities in particular ways. And so they're experimenting with it, but it's not just a simple case of like, oh, Chinese people are, we're all brainless, we just say whatever. No, it's like, this is a space, and we use that sentiment when we're irritated that those local developers are seizing our land and are not paying for it. We'll accuse them of, being, traitors and sellouts, and you deploy that nationalist language against them, and who knows how that could go. Yeah.
Question, blue stripe shirt. Yes,
just to follow up on this good question over here, about how people react to the increasing blanket of central control and the right of speech. When I lived in authoritarian governments, my name is Peter Pease, I'm now an international consultant, but I was a center director here at the university. One thing you didn't do is you didn't talk on television. No conversations on television. You see in China now, it's a very high technical imagery of people on the street. They know what everyone is thinking, where everyone is going. They're able to match this with digital technology. How are people talking to each other?
Yeah, that's actually
watching what they say.
So that's a really good question, and I think that kind of gets at the heart of one of the shifts that's taking place. If it was 20 years ago, if it was like late 1990s, early 2000s, the answer to that question would have been, certainly in private spaces and certainly in colleges, you didn't feel like you had to watch what you speak. But he went in further than that. I mean, in the late 90s, early 2000s, in the era when you and I were in Washington D.C., you had sort of noted public intellectuals who felt comfortable spouting off in like newspaper editorials that were sort of in this partially commercialized media, and you'd be sort of like, something like Hu Weifang would be like, well, People's Republic, why do our courts have to be called people's courts? They should just be called courts. We should, that was literally an op-ed that he wrote that was sort of, dancing around the edges of whether or not, what was the party's relationship to the court system. That space starts constricting early on. So by the, 2008, 2009, you've already started to see the public intellectuals begin to come under much tighter, the Weibo, then you get the public intellectuals, it's really after 2012, 2013, they start getting the campaign against them. But then you start thinking, well, there's still this private degree of space in the colleges, in the dinner tables, in the university classrooms. What I feel now is I see that space constricting within the schools themselves. I feel like my friends who are sort of university professors are like, we now feel we've already seen people being called out for things they've said in the classroom when they're just talking to their students, either fired or the relevant individual comes to talk to them, and so we're now much more careful about what we're saying in these spaces. Dinner table conversations, no, I mean that's still there's no sense. This is not the informer in the family. That you have to do that. You want to go back to the Cultural Revolution era. That hasn't happened yet. What is interesting, and this has been flagged to me by some Chinese individuals, is different social media platforms in China, Weibo, the equivalent of Twitter, individual followers could have millions, 10 million, 15 million people. That space closed down significantly, as I mentioned, after 2012 to 2013, because the party decided we need to get better control over that, and we'll actually have a couple of those guys call them onto TV and make them confess to their wrongs, and then people got the message, we're not going to do that. WeChat, different platform, more akin to Facebook, sort of smaller networks of people, and previously, Chinese party interpenetration into those zones too. But a lot of people would sort of feel like, even if it's just a small WeChat group, I feel perfectly comfortable talking about stuff. I'm not going to say that I'm announcing a protest, but I still feel comfortable talking. I've had a couple people say to me recently that they've now, they're getting notifications like, we're watching this. And so even in those more closed spaces. But you're flagging what about even more private stuff? Yeah, I mean, that would be the thing I'd really watch, where you're like, at some point does you start going back into the really closed domains where you have to worry about what you're saying to your friends in the elevators or stuff. I'm not there yet, but that's the thing to watch.
Okay, there's a lovely young woman wearing white, and then Kelsey. In that order.
Okay, all right, thank you. So my name is Susan Mays, and I'm at the College of Liberal Arts. So a lot of people say that after the Cultural Revolution, certainly after Tiananmen Square, that the CCP realized that they needed economic reform and development in order to kind of appease the people and maintain and stay in power. But certainly after Tiananmen Square, it's clear that they weren't going to politically reform. Nonetheless, as you mentioned, certain political norms did develop, so there were some, reasonable norms that could be pointed to. You also said, though, that they failed to create institutions. Do you think that, they were probably never really trying to build institutions that would be normal or acceptable to the Western world, so it's not like they were ever trying to build wonderful institutions. So the fact that they did achieve this economic prosperity and global integration is the resurgence of the CCP under Xi. Do you think that's, really more one-man driven and, a power-besotted individual driven, or is this maybe something we could have expected of the party reasserting itself strongly and basically claiming success and claiming a stronger role and reinserting itself into various organizations, businesses, other types of organizations that you pointed out rightly?
So the question was sort of dealing with the party's earlier efforts to sort of create other types of norms. What does this, how should we regard this in terms of the reassertion of the party power, as the party begins to sort of come back? Well, let me say one word first about the earlier point. So there's this debate of like, well, is what's taking place right now, is this sort of the inevitable result? Because even back in 1978, we knew that this was a one-party state, and so it was everything that was going on in terms of political development was kind of like a farce. I'm actually not, that position I don't agree with. I really really think that in the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s, there were people both inside and outside the party. They weren't interested in fundamentally, they weren't interested in democratization, but they were grappling with some pretty core issues. They were grappling with issues of like, if the local party secretary in my town or my township or my village has control over all the levers of information and all the levers of power, how do I ensure that this guy doesn't just engage in like massive abuses or corruption and blindly cheat his superiors? How do you create effective supervising mechanisms to sort of check centralization of power at the local levels? How do you ensure that that guy doesn't abuse the rights of his citizens and result in a mass riot where the farmers get together and burn down the county party headquarters? I think that's the kind of things that the party was grappling with, and those institutions, whether they're local village elections, whether they are intra-party democracy, whether there's sort of some greater tolerance of civil society. All of these were efforts on the part of people, not just outside in society itself, but within the party itself, to kind of grapple with those problems. The problem for me was that at each point I look at each of those reforms, public interest lawyers, I look at the local, local elections. The problem is, at some point, people start using those channels, and they're not just using it against village officials, they start using it at township or county level. And at each of those core points, the party sees shades of 1989, and they move in to sort of curtail their prior reforms. And so that period that I would say sort of 89 up to early 2000s is a one step forward, one step back, where you have these little sprouts that could have grown into something else, but they get repeatedly whacked back at every point when they might have evolved in a different direction. And the sad part about that is, that's the alternative story. Look, I don't even know if it would have turned into democracy, I don't know, but I could look back at that period, 2003, and I could sort of say, this could kind of go in a different direction. Taiwan, there's an interesting comparison between sort of 2003 China and Taiwan in the early 70s, and I could, if I was going to try to spin out the alternative history that didn't happen, you could imagine a 30 or 40 year process which sort of, the CCP decides it's going to go in a different direction, figures within the party move in a different, didn't happen, so that was cut off. And I think what that means is by the time you do get up to 2012, when they need to address massive corruption within the party itself, there really isn't. There's no other independent. There's nothing like the DPP, the sort of the Taiwan opposition or the South Korean. There's no other force out there that you could even cut a deal with. You could build up. There's no other institution outside the party itself. And consequently, what they do, like I mentioned, is they flip back to their own methods. Now, your question was, is this just Xi Jinping himself? It's not just Xi himself. There are clearly people who support him, who are with him. There are people that he's marginalizing and taking down as he rises in power. But I think there are a lot of people who are like, there is a problem in our society, and at the time, we need a strong man right now to make the trains run on time, to get things operating, and I'm willing to sign up on this. And I think he tactically used this in a very, very savvy way to marginalize one person after another. First Bo Xilai, then Zhou Yongkang, then the generals, where you take out individual groups, and at each point people are like, well, I'll sign up to you getting rid of Bo Xilai, and then, well, okay, the security czar, yeah, you got to take him out too, and then you recurve the military, and at some point, then Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao start to realize, ooh, but by then, maybe it's too late, and enough people are on your side, and so, I think there's a lot of fear and discontent within the system right now, but there's nothing else out there other than Xi that I can see. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kelsey Ritchie. I'm a second-year global policy student here at the LBJ School. I'm interested in hearing your perspective a little bit more on the religious repression side. You talked about a little bit, especially with the Muslim groups. You mentioned that it wasn't an imminent threat to Chinese security, but kind of from a domestic politics standpoint, what does the future of international pressure to halt the Strike Hard campaign against the Muslim populations, what does that look like as far as domestic politics goes? Will they feel that international pressure? And does Beijing view Islamic extremism as a potential threat in the future?
So, there have been, there have been major terrorist incidents within China itself. The big stabbing incident in Kunming in 2000 and, do you remember the date on it? 2003 14 to them. It isn't just like Beijing isn't totally making this stuff up. That there actually are situations where there have been violence against civilians and against state apparatus themselves. So there's something out there now. Does that mean that you should go taking 10% of the entire population and throwing them into re-education camps? That's like a totally different question. Let me flip back a little bit. You were asking about the history of this. So in terms of the interaction with religion generally, I think one of the interesting things to realize is during the Maoist era, party policy, particularly to the Cultural Revolution, very clear. We're going to wipe out religion. We're literally going to wipe out all religion. Christianity, Muslim, Buddhism, everything. Starting in the Reform era, party backs off, and they kind of basically, party itself, we're going to be atheist, but with respect to society at large, we're going to open up space for all of you guys, Buddhists, Muslims, Christians. We're going to create a patriotic church structure. There's going to, we're still going to try to control it, but we're no longer going to try to wipe it out. We're kind of backing off, but in a uniform manner from all of you guys. The shift that's taking place now, which worries me, is I think that the party is beginning to start to play favorites. They actually, as they pivot back to tradition, they're creating a definition of Chinese tradition as a way to defend against foreign influences. Part of that involves starting to single out who's really Chinese, and I think that's they could clearly start to look at the Buddhist stuff in a different way, and so the Islam and Christianity are now, you're starting to see this, it's like a creeping suspicion that's not just, it's in the party, it reinforces stuff in society, and this is now beginning to pick up. It's blowing up in Xinjiang in particular, directed at the Uyghurs, but I just sense, I would be looking, you guys in Texas have got folks who focus particularly on the Christian stuff. I think there have been major shutdowns. Zion Church in Beijing just within the last 48 hours, big stuff in Henan, the decrucification where you're pulling the crosses down off of stuff. That was province in Zhejiang for a number of years, but that was contained to Zhejiang. This now seems to be spreading into other provinces. Anyway, the point being, the stuff that's happening to the Christians is not remotely what's happening to the Uyghurs, but there's something now blowing up, and it's linked to these anti-terrorist concerns. It's linked to sort of ethnic stability, but it's gone way over a line in terms of, I'm just going to begin detaining people. It's coming close to labeling the entire population as presumptively problematic, and we need to rotate them through political education camps to make sure that we don't have problems. And you can start to see that, once the security forces start getting, you flood them with a lot of money, people want to produce results, people get, your line officer, I'm going to show that I'm doing a good job. It just escalates, and this is now just way on a different level of magnitude. I think, of course, at the end of the day, what happens is it just ends up in more radicalization. You start doing stuff like this, and people have been separated from their parents at a young age. People remember the indignities they were. This will come back to haunt China at some point. Outside pressure, I don't know. I mean, at the moment, it's an interesting question. Is you're getting some of the, U.S. I think yesterday Uyghurs were in the White House. I think that was right. So you're actually getting the U.S. starting to, potentially raise concerns about this. I'd be interested at the point at which some of the Muslim countries start to speak up, and I haven't seen that happen yet. I don't know. At some point, does that you get enough of a pushback, and China worries about the impact on its international image? The problem is that this domestic priorities are so strong. I think that the outside pressure. Once they're going into lockdown mode. I don't know how much this outside pressure happens, but certainly if it's just the United States, it's going to probably be easier to shrug your shoulders.
We have time for one last question. How about somebody who didn't get to have a question? Okay. Claire, did you want a second chance?
Sure. I was going to ask a follow-up question. So, especially with neighboring like Cambodia repatriates Uyghurs, how do we change? Well, I know you've said that you are not foreign policy, but I would love to hear what you think about the other countries in the region playing into domestic politics.
So, I think that you're talking near in. I think countries that are very close to China are. that's where, as the domestic, this is where some of those, the domestic concerns, how could I draw the analogy? I mean, when you're really close to a very large and very powerful country, the domestic stuff that plays out in that country has a direct impact in your own. So if the United States is really worried about the drug war, their domestic policies about that are going to have direct impact on Colombia and then start to play into the things that go on there. So too, if domestic priorities in China are, we need to target diaspora populations of Chinese living in Philippines or Malaysia, or we want to force repatriation of Uyghurs, close in countries like in Cambodia or the Philippines are going to find it much harder to resist those types of pressures. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a good example of particularly if you're in a one-on-one, if it's Beijing with Cambodia, it's hard for the individual country to speak. I think that at the end of the day, if you want to start raising these issues, really you have to have that sort of collective effort to address them. Have a forum in which a group of countries that are all affected by these policies sort of start to say, well, collectively we're going to express this position, which is of course one thing China just definitely does not want to happen. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to thank Carl, but before you leave, let Elizabeth give her, we have some exciting events coming up, so let's thank Carl.
Thank you.